Hello, friends. My name is Matt, and I'm the youth and family pastor at Cornerstone Church in Marshfield. And I'm here today with your Cornerstone Connection, a daily devotional. So, if you perhaps saw my last connection, I talked about the topic of surrender and this whole concept that God gives us throughout the entire Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, that to surrender to Him actually means life. And this can be a hard pill to swallow. It can be hard for us to come to and overcome our flesh and our nature in order to actually do that. But this is what God calls us to do. Now today I'm going to lead us to another S word, and it's the word suffering. Fun one again, right? Well, in my devotional that I go through almost on a daily basis by Timothy Keller, highly recommend it. It's very good. In today's entry, he talked about suffering. And he said, you know what, there's generally two approaches to suffering and its purpose. And they can be summed up with a couple of words. One approach is the moralist approach, and then another approach is the cynical approach or the cynic approach. I want to just read what he has to say about these two approaches. He says, the moralist says that the purpose of suffering is simple. It's there to bring you back to God. He says sometimes that may be, but not always. Then he says, then there's the cynic. And the cynic also says the purpose of suffering is simple. There isn't any. But Keller goes on to say this. He says, godly wisdom understands that God has purposes, but they are deeply hidden. So Keller is saying, if we approach suffering with godly wisdom, we may not always know the purpose, but that doesn't mean it's void of purpose. That doesn't mean that this suffering doesn't have purpose. We may not just know what that purpose is, and we may never know, but we may not know what it is yet. But godly wisdom says there is a purpose for this, but sometimes God's purposes are deeply hidden. And then he asks two really pointed but very important questions that we need to ask ourselves. He says, have you reached the point in your life where suffering no longer calls God's character into question? And then he says, do you trust him, even in your pain and discouragement? Wow. I'll let you answer those questions for yourself, but they're extremely important. Have you reached a point in your life where suffering no longer calls God's character into question? And do you trust him, even in your pain and discouragement? Well, it leads me to the text I want to bring you to today in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I'm certain that I have done a connection on this text before, but it's one of my favorites and applies well to that devotional today. The Apostle Paul is talking about great revelation that he has received from the Lord. And he also mentions in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, great revelation that somebody he knew received from the Lord. But he goes on in verse 7 to say this. He says, to keep me from becoming conceited, prideful, and think I'm better than I am, right? To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there is given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. I don't know about you, but that sounds like suffering. And from what we hear from Paul, it certainly was. Verse 8, he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly, Paul says, about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, and hardships, and persecutions, and difficulties. All that can be summed up to say, in suffering, right? For when I am weak, Paul says, then I am strong. Friends, I don't know what you're going through. I don't know if there is a disease that you're dealing with. I don't know if your marriage is on the rocks. I don't know if you're dealing with a wayward child. I don't know if finances are stressed. I don't know what you might be suffering through. But here's what I do know. God knows where you're suffering. And God has a purpose. And it simply might be this, that you might know his grace, his undeserved grace and love is sufficient for you. And that his incredible, unmatchable power is made perfect in your weakness. And perhaps in your suffering, he simply wants you to surrender to that truth and ultimately just surrender to him, receive his grace, and receive his power today. I pray that today that blesses you and that you are able to receive His grace and power to overcome whatever you're going through today, and know He has a purpose. Have a great day, friends. We'll see you next time on the Cornerstone Connection.